In the previous video, I showed one unfinished implementation for the carousel of the attractions panel. Now we'll analyze it in detail and think about other possibilities. A grid control is used when we need to display a fixed or variable amount of repetitive information. When the amount of information to be displayed is variable, the grid control is clearly used. This is our case, where the information to be displayed is that of the attractions in the database, which is clearly variable. But it's also used for a fixed amount of information. For example, to model these cards of the home panel, we'll also use a grid, because remember, it'll be composed of 4 cards, fixed, where only 2 are visible on the screen at a time. In this case, the grid will load 4 items of information, but each one with fixed values, not taken from the database. The case of attraction will be more similar to that of attractions, not only because the visual structure of the information displayed is almost identical to that of the longer cards of this other grid, but also because it's taken from the database. In this case, from the second level of the attraction transaction. Although the 3 carousels will be implemented by means of grids, they'll have particular features. 2 of them can be thought of as horizontal grids, while the one we'll study now will be of the flex type. The Genexus for Angular course includes this short video that describes the relationship of a grid with database attributes and the automatic loading of this grid. If you've never seen any of this, I recommend that you stop here and watch it. In the KB, I'd already implemented a first version of this grid in the copy of the attractions panel. I'm going to do it now with you in detail to explain the most relevant aspects from the front-ender's point of view. This area we've entered has a user interface and also coding. I'll start by inserting a grid in the second row of attractions. It opens this window for us to select attributes and/or variables that we want to be part of each item displayed by the grid. For our case, I could select, for example, country name, attraction photo, attraction rating. Note that it placed the 4 attributes side by side in 4 columns, but we can rearrange the elements as we want. This is different from what happens with tabular grids, where there are only columns, and we can't do this. We're going to choose the first case, clearly. I rearrange the elements as I want them to be displayed. And now I want to execute. So in the master panel, in the event associated with the attractions button, I uncomment the invocation to the panel that we're building. And as for the invocation to the copy that already has the advanced grid, I place it for the About button provisionally. Nothing's being shown on runtime. Why? First of all, let's look at the size of the row in which the grid is located. 100% of the remaining height after removing 712 dips. Obviously, there's no problem here. Among the properties of the grid, we see that it has auto grow set to false, so it will not grow as its content grows. And if we analyze each content item, we see that it will be modeled as this table, which has 3 columns and 2 rows, and whose height is set to platform default. And although it has auto grow set to true, since the grid doesn't have it, it will not apply. Let's see what happens if we change the auto grow of the grid to true. We don't want a grid with auto grow because we actually want a carousel that has a horizontal scroll. The height will have to be fixed. So I define this height for the row in which the grid is located, and I leave auto grow set to false. I'll have to work carefully with the sizes of this table. What we can see so far is that by using attributes, the grid loading is already automatic. It's a grid with attraction base table. I didn't even have to make it explicit in this property. It inferred it automatically. And in the background, Genexus builds a data provider that returns a collection SDT with all the necessary items to load the grid. Look at the navigation of this data provider. It goes to the attraction table, accessing country to get the country name. If we wanted to sort in descending order by attraction rating, note that it would be enough to do this. Define an order according to this attribute that's not ascending. And if we now ask to see the navigation list, here we see it reflected. In the implementation that I showed in the previous video, in which I didn't use attributes, I explicitly built a data provider, as well as the SDT that I use as a collection. And I also invoke it explicitly, so that it's loaded into the grid once I have its data. Remember that the refresh event will be triggered before the grid is loaded. So I call the data provider. It returns the collection of data, of items, loaded. And since I associate this collection with the grid, it'll make a load per item, firing for each one the load event, which is programmed here to alternate between the cards, those of small height and those of large height. That is to say, between these with a height of 260 and these other ones with a height of 560. In grids, we can define multiple layouts for their items. They don't have to be the same for all of them. And this is what I did in my grid. I defined two different layouts. This one that I called large, and this one, which is the default, which I called small. Although they look identical, actually they have one difference. The height of this table, which we can see is a canvas. That of the large layout is 560 dips, while that of the small layout is 260. We can already think of this grid as a flex container of this height, and with its items in column direction. The wrap property is enabled, so the first two tourist attractions returned will be these two. If we start counting them at 0, then we'll have this. 0 and 1 fit in the first column, but 2 and 3 do not, so they go to a second column, and 4 and 5 in a third column, and so on. Note that we can establish the alternation of the cards by looking at these four, because later the scheme will be repeated. Numbers 0 and 3 will correspond to small height, and 1 and 2 to large height. For their multiples, the same scheme applies, and that's why I solved it in this way. In refresh, I set the counter of the attraction to 0, and then I calculate, for each item to be loaded in the grid, the position of the item, which will be the rest of that counter divided by 4. That is to say, it'll be 0, 1, 2, or 3. If it's 0 or 3, I instruct it to load the item with the small layout, and if it's 1 or 2, with the large layout. Note that this is the name of the grid, and this is the property that indicates which is the layout of the item. If we now look at the control info section of the grid, we see that here I specified that it's not a common grid, but a flex one. Look at all the options we have. This one corresponds to the default. Let's see that of the grid we inserted in attractions. Here, I clearly changed it to flex. But also note that the horizontal one appears, which can be convenient to implement the other carousels. Also note that after choosing the flex grid type, the typical properties of a flex container appear: flex direction, flex wrap, justification, alignment. Since the sum of the height of a small and a large card is 260 plus 560, that is 820, and the grid has auto grow set to false, and the row in which it's located is 852 dips, I don't know why I entered that value, when the space missing from the 820 dips is the spacing of the cards, something I haven't implemented yet. But we can already see that it's 11 pixels. I also have to add, as we'll see in the next video, the space of the scroll bar. But let's see what happens if I set a value lower than the sum of the heights of the cards, such as 800, for example. There's not enough space to place 2 cards per column, so this happens. In short, if the grid doesn't have autogrow, the number of items that'll be placed in each column will depend on the height of each item and the height of the cell in which that grid is located. Remember that the columns are created because of the wrap. If there were no wrap, there would be a single column, since the direction is column. I don't know if you notice it, but there's a double scroll bar. I'll press F12 to see it better. We have a vertical scroll bar of the grid and the scroll bar of the panel. On the other hand, if the property has wrap enabled, and we set the row height, for example, to 850 dips for the moment, note that we have the vertical scroll bar of the page. And now for the grid, a horizontal scroll bar instead of a vertical one. And also, of course, 2 cards can be placed in each column. Well,
Bueno, voy a
I'll end
interrumpir
this
aquí
video
este
here
video
so
para
that
que
it
no
doesn't
se nos
become
haga
boring.
pesado y en el
In the next one,
siguiente
we'll
veremos
see in
el
some
punto de
detail
inicio y la
the implementation of
implementación
the
del
layout of
layout
each
de
card
cada
of the
parte
grid,
del grid,
and then
para
return to
luego
the grid
volver
itself.
sobre el grid propiamente dicho.
See you
Los
soon!
espero.